In this episode, I talk with my old friend Steve Tatham, who is the executive creative director of a new theme park being built by Universal Studios in Orlando. It's a story of creativity and bold moves along the way. I think you're really going to enjoy it, so let's dive in. Welcome to the Superbold podcast. I'm Fred Joyal, your host, and I'm always talking to interesting people in my life who have made bold moves and had great impact on the world and just had interesting lives. And my guest today is somebody that I met back when I was dabbling in stand-up many, many years ago, Steve Tatham. He is now the executive creator director of Epic Universe, which is a new theme park that Universal is building in Florida. Just a magnificent creation. Steve being the executive creative director of that kind of blows my mind that what is involved in that. So we're gonna find out how he got here and what's going on with the Epic Universe. Steve, great to see you again. Welcome to the podcast.
Good to see you, Fred. It's been too long.
Yeah, I mean, we were back in the days working with Bill Bronner, and we would go and do these politically focused stand-up routines. I can't even remember what decade it was, but it feels like something in the 90s.
I mean, too bad we're not doing it now. There's so much material that writes itself.
Yeah, we had to work for our jokes back then. So talk a little bit about Epic Universe first, and then we'll talk about how you got here in this career.
Sure. Now, I'm thrilled to say I've been on this for many years now, but it has been made public. So there are announcements, there are videos out there, there are blog posts, there are all kinds of articles about Epic Universe, so you can find the details of the project. And more will be rolled out soon, so watch for those. And so I'm very excited to be able to share it. I can't go into the detail of all of the content of the park, but feel free to look it up and research it yourself. But in short, it's a major new theme park in Orlando. It's a full-scale park, more than 100 acres, the size of the existing major parks that are here in Orlando. And it's set to open at the beginning of next year, before next summer. So we're very excited. We're in the throes of construction, and we are going to be wrapping up that in the coming months and then getting ready for our guests to come next year.
I think, and one of the great ways you can follow Steve on LinkedIn, and you'll see a lot of the announcements as they roll out, but also there's a whole slew of videos on YouTube really rolling out all of the things. There's 5 different what do they call them? Universes?
Right. So there are 5 different worlds inside of Epic Universe, and we have announced the names of those, and we're announcing the details about once a month or so. And so I can say what they are. So we have Dark Universe, the home of Universal Monsters, is one of our worlds inside of the park. There's Super Nintendo World. There's the Wizarding World, the Ministry of Magic, and there's Celestial Park, which is an original intellectual property that we've created, which is this heart of our park. And there's Berk, the Isle of Berk from How to Train Your Dragon. So we're really excited. It's a broad range of things that will appeal to a wide swath of guests. So we're very excited about the content and the way that they all come together in one epic universe.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be incredible. I can't wait to be there because I've seen enough of the graphics of the design and the rides and stuff. And I think they just announced the 2 hotels they're building as well.
Right. So there are the hotel announcement is forthcoming. So, but they have announced the Stella Nova and the Terra Luna, which are 2 of the hotels, which I believe are open now for reservations for next year. And then there's the Helios Grand Hotel, which is the third hotel, which is right inside the park.
Yeah, so there's a hotel right inside the park. That's going to be
Yeah.
amazing. So
Yeah.
let's go back in time to your career beginning. What got you started in what is this trajectory? Uh,
So it started when I was a kid, really. I grew up in Orange County, California, in the shadow of Disneyland. My first job was at Disneyland. So it was always in my consciousness. And I just remember being a little kid at Universal Studios, riding the tram, looking at this stuff and thinking, somebody just made this up. I mean, that had to be somebody's job. I mean, they took a blank piece of paper and they either wrote a description of it or they drew a picture of it or they did something. And I was like, that would be the coolest job in the world. And turns out it is. But now I had doubts, like as I was going off to college and stuff. I'm like, well, I mean, like, what do you even study and how does that work? And is it really a job? I mean, you can't be making a new theme park all the time. So they must just make one and then they don't work on anything for a while. Cause I just didn't really get how that was a full-time lifelong career. I learned more about that and I ended up writing my own college major. Now they have programs in themed entertainment, but I wrote my own major in film design, studying film and architecture and these ancillary arts, which really are the source of where people came from when this business was new. 60 years ago when Walt Disney was designing Disneyland, he used architects and film set designers. So film and architecture are
so
really
so basically the same people that built sets for movies, the elaborate sets and
yeah,
technology to have as the what's used in film. I mean, I can remember years ago when they do so much digitally now, but they would build these incredible sets with a forced perspective of a city street.
yeah,
And I would look at it and go, this is just incredible that this works and that somebody conceives of this and accurately builds it. So yeah,
yeah.
Walt Disney said, I'm going to use this and start to build a park. I'm going to,
Right.
use the same people.
And we're still using those techniques. We have forced perspective that we use in our park. I was looking at some of the construction this very morning, and we were talking about the forced perspective. So those techniques are alive and well. And so when I, was finishing up my undergrad, I would meet people. It was a tour guide at Universal Studios, and I would go down to the art department, and I would say, like, how did you get into this? Profession, and they all told me you have to go to architecture school. So I did. Then I went to get my master's in architecture, and I immediately, 3 months after I graduated, was working at Walt Disney Imagineering, and so I worked at Universal Studios and at Disney my entire career.
Wow. So, so in an Imagineer, I just love the idea that that's a job description. I just love that name for a job. I think I would have been very interested in that myself, but I'm colorblind. So, a lot of design work, when I got into advertising, my art directing skills were nominal, as was my dressing style. People were
Well, you're
constantly
looking
saying,
sharp now. You seem to
yeah,
have over.
years and years of learning to read colors better and dress better. Because people would just say, that shirt doesn't go with anything else you're wearing.
You need
Um,
granulables, those clothing that you used to be able to match up, and they would, you just put numbers on your shirts and your
yeah.
pants and everything, so you could sync them.
Well, at one point when I was doing a lot of business, my my wife laid out my shirts and ties and took pictures of everything because I'd be on the road with five shirts and five ties and I wouldn't know what to do. I was like, what goes with this shirt?
Yeah, art
Uh,
direction may not be the right field for you in that case.
yeah. so so you started working at Disney and then you moved over to Universal and
Yeah, I was at Disney for like 28 years, and then Universal called me up and they said, we have this opportunity in Japan. Would you be interested? And I was like, no, I don't think so. And then they do what they do, these headhunters, they're like, oh, maybe you know somebody, let's have coffee and maybe you can. And of course, then they tell you about the position. And in that case, I was just like, oh, that sounds pretty good. And so after much thought and discussion with the family and everything, about a year later, I was living in Japan.
Now,
And so,
how old were your kids at this point?
well, so they were both in high school. And so my son, who was going to the LA County High School for the Arts in the film program, which was a new program there, he was the first class. So he was, he couldn't find that same thing in Japan. So he said, I want to stay. And no, it was the other way around. So he first came. He first said, like, I'm up for the experience. And he later decided he wanted to go back and finish with his friends in school. But my daughter was wanted to stay in LA. So my wife ended up staying with my daughter in LA. I went with my son to Japan. And then my son called my daughter. She was a very serious ballerina at the time. And she was in Boston over the summer, the first summer after my son and I moved to Japan. And she called me from Boston and said, Dad, I want to come to Japan. I was like, great. How long you going to stay? And she's like, a year. All right, coming over. So I thought we were all going to be in Japan. Then my son's like, I want to go back because he was doing this program at LACSA. And so then they switched. And so then after that, when my son, I guess it was when he graduated, he came back. So all four of us and the dog, we were all in Japan at the end. And that's when Universal's like, well, we have this project Epic Universe and we want you to come lead the project. And so I went home and I was like, you guys, we're moving to Orlando. And they're like, hell, if we're moving to Orlando, my daughter's like, I'm going into my senior year of high school. I'm not moving to Orlando. My son was taking, at this point, he's now done with high school. He was like, I'm not taking my gap year, which I was going to do if you guys were all in Japan and hang out in Japan. I'm not going to take a gap year in Orlando. So, well, what about my hopes and dreams? But they had already moved to Japan for me to live my hopes and dreams. So I ended up telling Universal no. And then, so we stayed in Japan for that year. And then a year later, when my kids both were now off at college, they said, how about now? You want to come now? I was like, well, that never happens that you get that second chance. So then I moved to Orlando to work on this project.
So what were you doing in Japan? It was an existing Universal?
Oh, yeah. So there's Universal Studios Japan, which is in Osaka. And so I was running the local design team there they have a Cool Japan Festival. So they do new events and shows and experiences every year. And so I was leading that team and also for localized design. So if they wanted to do a new restaurant or a new smaller scale developments, not the big theme park level development, smaller scale stuff like Christmas decorations and, seasonal events and things like that. So I was leading that local design team. And that was we had about 50 some people on that team.
And so I know that parks roll out rides at a certain point. Which is a big deal, right? To say like, we're getting rid of this ride or we're updating this ride or we're adding this new ride. That's a whole other thing.
Right. So that work is all done by Universal Creative. And that's when I left Osaka to join that team because, to do a larger scale development. So there was a large scale development that was happening while I was in Osaka, and that was the Super Nintendo World, which was being built in Osaka. But I was not on that team because I was the local team. Because when I first went to Osaka, Universal didn't, and I mean, it's sort of a complicated history, but Universal didn't own the theme park at that point. They were licensing the name, and then Universal acquired that park while I was there. So then I switched from being a local employee of the Osaka-based company to being an employee of the parent company, and so that's when my position changed.
So when did you move to Orlando?
That was in 2019.
Yeah, so you've been 5 years on this project.
But
I want to ask you about your kids. Do you think this helped your kids to be like bold and flexible in chasing their dreams and not being set in their ways and stuff?
For sure, it absolutely did. And so when we came to Orlando, it was the end of 2019. We bought a house in January of 2020, and then there's COVID. So the kids were then both off at college. So they came to the house because all their classes were virtual at that point. And so my daughter's upstairs in her room, and I'm like, "What are you doing up there all the time?" And she goes, "Well, I've started a business. I'm 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 tutoring." I'm like, "Well, what are you teaching?" And she's like, "Japanese." So she
Ah,
had learned Japanese and enough so that now she's teaching Japanese. So she, I mean, the fact that she started a business and she's teaching Japanese and I didn't even know it is certainly something she would not have done. Obviously, she's a few years older, but it just, she really grew, I think, at having that experience. And I remember the first day she was in Japan. She came and she, it's Japan, so you take the train everywhere. So she comes home from school. She took the train, and she's like, "Dad, I don't think I can do this." I go, "Well, what do you mean?" And she goes, "Well, I don't speak Japanese." And I was like, "But you're at an international school, and all the instructions in English." She says, "Yeah, but at lunch the language is Japanese. Everybody speaks Japanese because most of the students there were Japanese." And so I'm like, "Well, let's just see how it goes." And so she was forced to do that. She was just thrown in this circumstance. Whereas I didn't learn any Japanese, even though I tried and I had a tutor, but I had a translator at work. So they didn't want me to speak Japanese because it would just slow things down. And then at home, I would speak Japanese. My daughter would be just like, "Dad, don't embarrass yourself." Don't, you know. But yeah, absolutely. It was great. I mean, there were many challenges, but I think for both of them, it was great. And it also allowed them to experience just a lot of things like being the other, because they live a privileged existence as two white kids with resources and stuff like that. And all of a sudden they're in Japan, where I'm not saying it's like being a person of color in the United States, but they at least experience what it's like to be different and to be excluded from certain things socially and to have to adapt to another culture. And so there was a lot of growth opportunity to that. And I think that helps with your empathy.
yeah, I mean, and their ability to adapt, adaptability is what's going to save people now because stuff's changing too fast. If you're not
Yeah,
adaptable, you're going to be fossil fuel at some point. Uh,
absolutely.
yeah, and
Absolutely.
and so and a lot, so many parents are so busy protecting their child from any adversity and any challenge and any strain or pain or suffering or difficulty that they need a service dog to go to the grocery store. They've developed nothing, whereas
Yeah.
these sort of almost because of your job offers, your kid's been forced to adapt to what dad's next crazy decision
Right,
was.
right. And here's one difference. I remember being when we lived in LA that one of our neighbors' kids, and she was, I don't know, 8 or something, she was walking down the street and by herself. And this is like a very safe suburban neighborhood. And one of the neighbors called and said, "We saw her walking down the street. We were going to call the police and blah, blah, blah." She was walking down the street. And parents are so protective now that a kid can't walk down the street like 2 doors from their house. And so in Japan, there's a TV series called My First Errand, whatever it's called in Japanese. And it shows kids who are like 4 years old going off to the store by themselves to get groceries for the family, because that's what happens in Japan. And I remember one of the first days I was there, I was living in an apartment before we got the house, and we were all there. But so I was living in this apartment. I get in the elevator, and a little kid, preschool kid, gets in the elevator, and I'm holding the button, waiting for the parent, the chaperone, the nanny, whoever, the big sister, who's ever with this kid. I'm waiting and waiting and waiting, and the kid's looking up at me like, "What are you waiting for?" And I'm like, "Oh, I guess no one's coming. This kid is going by himself." And he couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. And
Wow.
so in the elevator, he goes down and he just walks out to wherever he's going, school, I guess, preschool maybe, and that I got used to it. Just it's very low crime in Japan, so it's safe. So they're in their own kind of bubble. There just isn't street. I mean, there's yakuza and organized crime, but not for 5-year-olds. I mean, they're pretty safe in that culture. So they have a lot of independence, and so like I freaked out that my daughter's gonna. It was like a 45-minute plus train ride, and she had to change trains and all that. And so we did a couple practice runs, but after a day or two, she's just off in the city by herself. And then she would just go, she could go anywhere she wanted. In Japan, you can go anywhere you want in the country, just hop on a few trains. So that was really good for independence.
Yeah. And, it's a great time to learn a language, and a great way to learn a language is to be just immersed in it like she was. It's like, I want to be able to understand these kids and talk to them. I have to learn. Whereas you got around it, and your employers didn't even want you to waste your time learning it. And we learn languages slower. I mean, our
brains aren't as plastic. Plus, they would translate every email. So like, there's no incentive for me to learn.
There's the easy way that you're going to default to over and over again. So let's talk about what's it like to start. Now, they had already started planning Epic Universe.
Well, see, that's the thing. So I was called at the beginning of 2017. I had been in Japan now a couple of years when they asked me, when they were first thinking about this project. And so that's when I would have gotten involved in all the what called Blue Sky and all the initial design work. So I didn't miss out on a year of that. There were discussions, but I missed out on being in the throes of that because I made this decision to stay with my family. Now, I don't regret that. We had a great year together as a family, one of the best years ever. And so that was worth it. But I did make a sacrifice career-wise in that I did miss out on some of that design. So that design was kind of, a lot of it was just baked by the time I joined the project officially. And so I'm now executing that design, which was created by the design team that came before me. So that's what I missed out on. And I mean, I like I said, I don't regret it. I think it was worth it, but you always have to make choices.
Yeah, it's an embarrassment of riches kind of thing, but also it's a painful choice. But I also, when I talk about boldness, it's not just about taking giant risks and stuff like that. It's being bold enough to say, my family's more important this year than that job that I really like. So it takes boldness to make a sacrifice like that. And adhere to your priorities rather than say, and I can remember, my dad's generation was going up. It was like, if dad moved, you moved. It was almost like army brats. It's like, you never had a choice where dad was going to, what base.
And I guess I thought our family was that way until I announced that we were moving to Orlando and found out it was very poorly received. And I was just like, well, I already dragged him to Japan for this job. Now I'm going to drag him to Orlando for another job. And that didn't seem very fair. So, I mean, had I been single, I would have moved and I would have been part of that. But I think this was just, it was a better experience. So, because now with the success of this project, then I'll have all kinds of choices going forward.
Yeah. And the unintended consequence is the gifts your child, both your kids received by being immersed in a different culture and bounced around and stuff like that. And also being bold enough to say, I want to go back to LA and finish my education and just learning this. I mean, you're setting, kids do what their parents do, not what their parents say. And you set an example that says, look, I'm taking a big shot here. This is a great opportunity, and there's going to be all sorts of challenges with it, but I'm not going to let that stop me. And I think
the decision we rightly or wrongly, we made the decision that we would let them decide what they wanted to do. That's why we were back and forth, and we were, sometimes all of us there, and sometimes, there was a lot of going back and forth at that time. And so the fact that we were all there, and then my son's like, yeah, I think I want to finish high school in LA. And we're like, okay. I mean, it was a little chaotic, but I think it was just a great, rich experience for both of them. So they both had you know, they had opportunities in LA and in Japan, and so they kind of went back and forth. Although my daughter ultimately, the last 3 years, she was exclusively in Japan and had her high school experience then. And so when we were in Orlando during COVID, of course, it was miserable for, you know, everyone on the planet, but we were, you know, trapped there, and we had no connection to Orlando. We hadn't lived there before, and you know, we moved there, and then the lockdown happened, and we were just, people are like, "How do you like Orlando?" I'm like, "I don't know. I haven't been more than 50 feet from my house, you know, because I was working from home, and the kids were going to school from home." But um, they had had that rich experience prior, and so by the time that they were locked down, they at least had that reference and understood the opportunity. They had connections outside of there all over the world now, because at that international school, they made friends from all over. I mean, they were mostly Japanese, but there were people from all over the world. So they just had a much broader view. So that was good timing, so that by the time things were clamped down, they had already had a frame of reference. Had they never left and then they were clamped down, it would just be a lot more isolating, I think.
Yeah, it, they had again it faced adversity already and had to adapt and say, all right, well, this is the reality. What am I going to do? Uh,
Yeah,
Instead of just complaining about it. So your
right,
daughter just starts a business and starts tutoring. You know, it's like, okay,
right.
we got to deal with this. So
Yeah.
let's talk about executing, building a theme park. I mean, it's such an amazing thing. It's like turning, you know, a Spider-Man comic into a Spider-Man movie, uh, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a very complex. I mean, there are 500 plus people on our team, and most of them are not in creative. About a third of them are in creative, and I oversee the creative aspects of the job. But there's also, as you can imagine, there are legal aspects, engineering aspects, there are finance aspects, there are just a lot of other people that are not in the creative group. And then beyond that, there are thousands and thousands of construction workers and general contractors and vendors, and those vendors are all over the world. So there are thousands of people engaged in this enterprise. So it's a super complex construction project. And so the idea is to integrate what we've done, the creative, in with all of this construction. So everybody has their own piece of the puzzle, and now we're assembling it so that it is one seamless experience. So it's complex.
And so, and it's complex times five because you really said we're going to create five unique worlds that have their own rides and their own eh, atmosphere and all of that. Just the idea of the construction, like people that know how to do it, because you know when you build a house or you build an office building, most of the walls are straight and everything's flat. This probably isn't a straight wall in this park.
We got a lot of curves, a lot of compound curves. We got to figure out.
Uh, and so and then there's ride construction, ride safety, ride testing, ride first of all ride invention, um, like and it's got to all integrate it as components of a park. It's like so. What does your uh, job look like? Are you just managing really smart people and you're the dumbest guy in the room? And uh,
That's the goal. So once the creative is baked, so you have everything down on paper, which we try to get things down on paper. They're not always there. We find gaps as we're building. But the idea is once you've designed something, you have the creative intent. And so I'm sort of the cop who makes sure that we're meeting the creative intent. So when we build it, it matches what we said we would build. So we're delivering on the promise of the premise. So that's kind of what it is. I'm just out there making sure that we're building the thing we said we were going to build and that we told our our leadership that we build, so that we're delivering on this great creative, because there's, it starts out with a series of beautiful pitches with very attractive concept art. And then when you build the thing, you got to make sure it matches that art that you said you were going to build, because they give us a lot of money. And so they expect us to build the thing we promised we'd build. So that's what's
Yeah,
working
just
out.
the translation from 2D to 3D seems massive,
Yes.
because it's like, oh yeah, it's going to be this. It's like, yeah, but how does it look when you turn it?
Right.
Like, what's the side of it? What's the back of it?
Right.
Where are the staff entrances and all of these things, all of the back end? That's the thing that amazes me, is how all of that stuff that runs it all has to be invisible somehow. Uh,
Yes.
are there underground tunnels and stuff like that they put in? Or
Well, there's a lot of back of house, and in fact, there's a whole team building the back of house and how we service these buildings, and sort of tricky ways to get into the park, and so there are service roads, but it's more complex than, say, a mall, because when you go to the mall, you can kind of see them load in the merchandise. So we don't want people to see that. So it is it is there are some design gymnastics involved.
and are there people that on your team that have been doing this sort of stuff their whole lives as well?
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
it's a weird little business that's growing. I mean, there are, because I've been speaking at universities and colleges and stuff, and so there are programs now which they didn't have. As I said earlier, I made up my own major when I was at Berkeley. They didn't have themed entertainment. Well, Berkeley still doesn't, but a lot of schools do. There's a handful of schools that have programs just dedicated to themed entertainment. In fact, just last night I was at one of these schools, and there are people who want to get into the business, which is weird, because as we talked about earlier, a lot of the initial people just came from the film business, or some of them came from architecture, and a lot of them come from theater. So it's really a mixture of those people. Now there are people who just want to be in the themed entertainment business from the get-go, so they have these programs. So those exist now. So I always hear from students who want to know more about it. And it is, I mean, it's a tiny business, but there are a lot of passionate people, and the people in the business usually stay in the business for a long time. So there's a lot of, old timers like me that we all know each other for the most part, because there's not that many people that do this kind of thing.
so this it just you've had a life of fulfilling a childhood dream. What does that
Yes.
feel like?
It feels really good. I love doing that, and you would think. I mean, I don't know what you would think, but I can imagine people might think, well, it can't be what you think it is. It's exactly what you think it is. You make stuff up, and then you make it, and then you get to watch people, uh, you know, buy tickets and go and enjoy it, and bring people that they love to make memories that last a lifetime. And I say I'm designing happiness, and it's pretty remarkable to be able to do that, because people don't have that many moments where they spend time with their families for an entire week, just having fun and making memories, and to be a part of that, it's a real privilege, and it's really cool. I mean, I wouldn't. There's nothing I'd rather be doing professionally.
I mean, there must be so many days of just like pure joy, where you're like, to me, you're walking in the park and finally something's up
Right.
and set up, and you go like, yes, that's how I imagined it looking. It's actually sitting there day by day. I mean, I'd be in the park till they kicked me out every night, just because it'd be so much.
Well, it's funny, because if you ask, somebody who's in this business, what's the best day on the job, and they'll always say, well, it's opening day, when I can finally see the guests come in and enjoy the things we've been dreaming about for so long. And somebody said, a friend of mine, he was asked, and he's like, that's the worst day, because I'm only imagining all the things that got cut and that I fought over and lost. And I walk around the park and I see the things that aren't there. And there is some of that, but you got to focus on the faces of the guests and see it from their perspective.
Yeah, I guess that it's just like when you produce a movie and you watch it, and the only scenes are the scenes that you think about are the ones that were cut, or the match cut that didn't
Right.
work, or and like that nobody even sees, and they're just
Right.
enjoying the whole movie, but you're going, oh, why did I let that actor? Why did I use that delivery of that line? It's like she sucked at that line,
Exactly.
and it's just the only take I had. We couldn't get back to the set, and so yeah, yeah, I'm realizing there's got to be some of that where we so wanted to execute this, and they eventually said no, that's too much.
I mean, this is what I say, and I'll say this to young designers, and I probably said it last night, that your job as a creative director or a creative person on a job like this is to have more ideas than money. You always have to have more ideas than money. So inevitably, you're not going to get everything done, because if you do, that means you haven't done your job, because you should have more and better ideas at the ready, so that if there's the opportunity, you can use those ideas. So there's always going to be stuff that didn't get built, and there's always a better idea if you wait till tomorrow. But you have to be happy with what you were able to do, and maybe that's a metaphor for life. Like if you wait till the perfect moment and you don't accept things, then you're never gonna have satisfying experience. How will you ever get married? How will you ever get a job? How will you ever commit to anything if you always wait till the ideal thing and the ideal set of circumstances? So you have to be prepared that if you're asked, you got a million ideas, because and 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 coming up with ideas is kind of the easy part. You can always come up with ideas. It's executing and getting them built and getting them paid for and executed properly and with the right materials and all that. That's really a lot harder. And so yeah, there's going to be ideas that are left on the table. But you know what? There's going to be more ideas tomorrow. So on the next job.
Yeah, and it goes all the way back to our time in stand up. It's like there's always more material. There was always a better way to tag that joke if you went like, oh, that's the way to finish that joke. But now I'm not on stage with it anymore. But there'll be always,
Well,
the creative life is to know that there's an infinite universe of ideas and creativity that you can tap into if you just believe in it.
or even an
An epic
epic
universe,
universe.
exactly. And the thing that the side thought I have is like, how the hell do you budget something like this?
I don't try. I mean, we have whole teams of people who figure out the cost of these things, and it's, I mean, an obscene amount of money that I will not talk about. But there are people who have the experience to know how much these things cost, and of course, over COVID, all of the commodities prices went through the roof, and the price of steel and this and that, and they have to figure all that into the calculations. And we designed something, and then all of a sudden it just costs this astronomical sum of money, and we're like, how did that happen? And it's not, the creative is just one part of it, but you have to build a box for these things to go in, and those boxes are expensive.
So we get to the opening day sometime in late spring of 2025. What's next for Steve at that point?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and so we'll see. I mean, there are opportunities. I'm talking to and exploring what those are. I'm focused really on the job that I'm doing now, but I think there'll be something next. I'm not ready to hang up the work boots just yet. So I think there are going to be opportunities. So we'll explore those as the time comes.
I can't imagine retiring from this kind of work. I mean,
I
yeah,
can't
I
either.
mean, you're going to die on a ride, I
Well,
think.
it's like, why would I do that? I don't understand. What are you saying? I can't comprehend what you're saying right now.
Yeah. Well, Steve, it's so great to hear this life story of yours and this adventure in creativity and bold challenges that you've taken on and presented your children with as well. And so I look forward to the backstage tour of this park when it's done.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
Come next
thanks for
summer.
coming on the podcast, and I'll see you soon. And
My
just really appreciate knowing you and seeing this fabulous arc of your life. So,
Well, thanks for having me on. I really
sure.
appreciate it.
All
It was a
right.
lot of fun.
Take care.